using color strategically to direct your audience to where you want them to look is the most underutilized strategy.
This is Cole Nussbaumer Knaflic, bestselling author of this famous book, Storytelling with Data. She's the founder and CEO of the company with the same name, and she has trained thousands of data professionals around the world to communicate data in a way that makes people care.
I'm a big fan of storyboarding, which I just think of as creating a visual outline of your content before you start creating any graphs or slides.
And that's why she matters to you, because if you've ever shared a great insight and nothing happened, this episode will help you fix that. You will learn why most presentations fail and how to make your presentation stick, how to prepare your data story before even touching PowerPoint. And you'll learn how to read the audience in real time. And lastly, the shift that helped Cole go from anxious to confident. So lots of interesting stuff in here. Let's dive in. Cole, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Gilbert. I'm excited to chat.
Me too. And the first thing I want to start with is, out of all the data visualization best practices that you've learned and that you've taught to other people, which one do you think is most important?
One most important. I think if I had to break it down to the number one tip for people who are communicating with data, it would be think about your audience. So often we communicate for ourselves or for our data, for our project, without giving enough thought to the actual people on the other end of that. They're the ones who we need to inform or change their mind or counter biases that they might be coming in with. So I think the more time as people are both doing the analysis, but especially as they're crafting the communication after that to explain to someone else what they've done, the more we can consider our audience, who they are, what they care about, what's going to matter to them, and then craft our communication with those needs in mind, the better job we'll be able to do of engaging them and ultimately communicating with them.
Awesome. I like that.
Well, and it's funny because it doesn't have anything to do with the data specifically, right?
Yeah, and that's what makes it interesting, right? Because many people are listening, data leader, data professionals, they chose that job mostly because they love the data, right?
Yeah.
Not because they signed up for a UX class or for how to talk to stakeholders.
Right.
How do you think people should do that? Get to know the audience better?
I think learning each time you communicate, and I think as I reflect back on my career, this is one of the things that happened along the way that I don't think I recognized it as it was happening, which is when you are talking about your work to someone else, whether it's a colleague or a manager or a peer, or you're presenting something at a meeting or at a conference, those are fantastic opportunities for some amazing real-time data collection. And you can do that by really observing the people with whom you're communicating. What are their facial expressions? Are they smiling? Are they nodding, meaning they're following along, they're paying attention? Are they leaning back and they look like they might be disengaged? Are their brows furrowed or lips pursed in ways that could indicate confusion? As you become aware of these just micro cues in other people's behavior, you can actually learn from that and then do things with it. So I historically I've spent a ton of time facilitating workshops, and it always amazes me the things that you can do when you're live with a group of people and how that influences whether people interact, how they get involved, whether they participate by things like where you stand in the room, or if somebody gets out their phone and they maybe look like they're starting to disengage, if you're standing and walk over toward that person as you're speaking, it can totally change their behavior. They put the phone away and tune back in. I spend a good amount of time talking about how people use their voice and body to get people's attention and maintain it, the cadence of how you speak, but just all these things that you can play with, which I recognize. You talked about people who get into data careers typically love the spreadsheets, the coding, the numbers, the logic of that, which is fantastic, but you will be able to serve your work so much better if you can also put a voice to it and a body and a face. And that's what you do by becoming, I guess, that voice of the data and working on how you communicate about your work and your analyses and your findings in the same way that you honed your skills for working with data. It takes time, it takes practice, it takes learning from each time, right? We talked about audience was the question. How do you learn what's working with them? So facial expressions, as we talked about, body language is one thing. You can also ask or be aware of what questions they are asking you and whether that means they're understanding and engaging and having questions about the right sorts of things. The right sorts of questions are about how do we use the data or how do we understand it thoroughly. I think the wrong sorts of questions are, or the kind that you can learn from and adjust, are, what does this mean when they're looking at the graph? Or how do I read this? And those questions, when they come up, really point at potential design issues of the data. The challenge, though, is those questions don't often come up because, especially if you're presenting to a senior audience, they're not going to want to say that they don't understand what they're looking at. And so you can gauge that sometimes by lack of discussion or lack of questions, particularly if what you're trying to communicate is something that they should pay attention to and they're not, then there's some sort of disconnect either in how you're explaining or the materials that you're using. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll pause.
Yeah, a lot to unpack. And I love that you talk about these micro expressions and how you own the room and how you facilitate. And I also know that you have mastered or you've taken a lot of steps in your journey, right? To becoming a better communicator.
Yeah.
And I can imagine for some people, it feels a bit daunting. Like, okay, I need to look at micro expressions, see what questions I can get. I do like the distinction between the right and the wrong questions though. This also makes me wonder, when you started out, what was your level or level of comfort or skill in communicating and presenting?
I would say my level was amateur at best. My level of comfort was not comfortable at all. I was a typical person who loves numbers and data and introverted, and my happy space was behind my computer coding and working with spreadsheets. And so I was fortunate, I think, to recognize relatively early on that I could make the most beautiful graph, the most beautiful slide or presentation, but that I was starting to limit how far that could go by my poor delivery of it. So if we rewind way back when, my first job out of undergrad, so I majored in math and then later went back to business school. But fresh out of a math degree, I was working at a bank in Seattle, and relatively early on, my boss's boss started inviting me to come to these senior management meetings. Quarterly meeting. It was mostly men, mostly quite a lot older than me, and I was a ball of nerves. And I recognized early on that I'd have my paper in front of me and I would be visibly shaking. So put the paper down on the desk so that people can't see my hands shake. I'd have the shaky voice, which that can be something that spirals, because if you're feeling nervous and you hear your voice shake, then that makes you more nervous and pay more attention to that. And then you get more nervous and then your voice starts shaking more. And so that's a bad spiral. Voices shake, by the way, because you are not getting sufficient air across your vocal cords. So it means you actually need to slow down, take deep breaths so that you have sufficient volume to be able to use your voice. And I used filler words like crazy. Looking back, I'm amazed that at the patience of my senior manager for putting me in front of these audiences. But I learned, and I got better over time. I don't think I got great in that role ever. I think I knew my data and I knew the analysis so well that part was able to carry me through. It was really when I was working at Google after that, that I started to understand more, I think, how to bring voice to my work in a way that worked, and still not at the get-go. But it was really when I started teaching classes about visualizing data, because I was so passionate about the topic that I think in the same way that just my knowledge of the data in banking had been enough to carry me through, the passion that I was able to exhibit as I was teaching salespeople and engineers at Google about how to make a graph and how to make that work was contagious. And so people would listen in spite of all of the other issues that came along with that. But then as I got comfortable with my content, it left some mind share free to really start to do what I talked about earlier, observe people in the room around me and understand how I can play with things like where I stand in the room or how I use my hands and my face and my voice to get people's attention or to change the level of energy in a room. And I think as I look back, I learned how to make graphs through a lot of trial and error and iterating and understanding each time what worked or what didn't work and how do I refine that. And as I look back, I use that exact same process for figuring out how to engage with an audience. And if I can do it, right, if I can go from the shaking leaf who only wanted to be behind her computer, I am a strong believer that anyone can. One of the myths that I would like to bust is that some people are just born natural speakers. I think maybe that happens occasionally, but most of the time when you see a really eloquent speaker, someone who's able to get your attention and engage you and make you care about what they care about, that is a practiced skill. And so spending the time to be aware of how you communicate and work to refine that is going to, I think, serve anyone well. I think it's going to especially serve those in analytical roles for whom maybe this is a little more uncomfortable. It's probably or oftentimes skills that haven't been honed intentionally over time. And so the energy and effort that you put into that will serve you so many-fold.
Yeah. I'm happy you pointed out, because it's so not true. I've seen it in many people that started so nervous doing a presentation, even for a small group, but with enough effort and practice and feedback, you can make incredible transformations. And anyone can do that. And maybe some people have an advantage. They are more talented, of course, but everyone can reach a really high level. And one thing that I also appreciate is that you point out that if you bring your enthusiasm to the table, whether it's about the content or the data or your visualizations, that's really infectious, right? People feel automatically more connected to your story and maybe be more forgiving about the filler words. And
I think that's key,
go ahead.
is finding, if you are in need of communicating something that you're not hugely passionate about, right? Because our work runs the spectrum from, there might be things you do that you are really fired up about naturally, and then that enthusiasm is going to come across. In cases, though, where there's something important that you need to communicate and you don't maybe have that intrinsic enthusiasm, you need to try to find it, because if you yourself aren't interested in what you're talking about, it is going to be really difficult to get other people interested in it. And as you said, that when you are enthusiastic, that energy is contagious. I remember back to, I was at a conference one time. I share this anecdote in Storytelling with You, which we can talk more about if you want. That was the third book. But was at this conference, and there was a speaker who was talking about an endangered bird in New Zealand. And, well, I didn't care naturally about this endangered bird in New Zealand, right? But he was so passionate about it that it made me care more than I otherwise would have, which I think is profound. And so if we can tap into that, right, and it's not about kind of overselling or overdoing passion in a space where we don't have it, but it's finding what are the interesting nuggets and how do I get at that and how do I relate those to my audience so that they're going to want to listen to what I have to say.
Yeah. And I have seen some data professionals who are very enthusiastic about the data but struggle to connect it with the business goals. So how is there a risk as well to be too enthusiastic about the data and your analysis and not enough about what's in it for the audience?
That's a fantastic point. Yeah, I think there is a danger there, because if you are going to ostracize people, that's probably too strong of a word, but yeah, if it's going to be a hindrance to making that connection, that's going to be problematic. And that's a situation where I think talking with other people, ideally other people outside of your immediate work function, about what you want to communicate, you can get some of those signals before you get to the real setting. And it could even be, it could be a spouse or a friend. Hey, can I take a couple minutes and just talk you through something that I'm really excited about, and have them ask you questions? And you'll be able to tell by their level of engagement and the types of questions they ask. One, those questions can be really insightful. And in the case where you are getting really deep in the data and missing those connections, person who doesn't have all the context will ask questions that might help you understand that. Or we talked earlier about how do you get to know your audience and what they care about? Well, if you could talk to somebody who's actually in your audience, or a stakeholder, or somebody who is going to come in with a different perspective and different goals than you have, it'd be really great to talk with that person ahead of time so that you can understand, are you able to connect with them through the data, or is there something bigger picture if you step back and think about what's motivating other people and why they should want to care, right? Not why you think they should care. And that's coming back to this really thinking of things from your audience's perspective piece, which is hard. It's much easier to think about communicating for ourselves. We live in our own heads, so that is the most obvious place from which to communicate. But when we can step outside of ourselves and try to think about what we want to say from someone else's point of view, that can be a really powerful strategy so that you can connect with those people when you are in the room with them.
I love that. And we've been discussing a bit about how to present, right? How to make your story resonate with people, how to read cues from their faces if they're connected or if they may be more connected with their phone. What we haven't spoken about is how you prepare that presentation, because of course there's different things involved, like data visualization, making the storyboard. What's your approach for a data presentation? How do you do that when you start until the moment you know, okay, it's good enough to present?
So I would say, so let's assume the analysis has already been undertaken or the project's been finished. You've looked at everything in a robust way. You already know what you want to say, and now it's time to come up with the materials that are going to help you get that across to someone else and to prepare yourself to be able to play a role in that. I'm a big fan of starting low tech. Some of our favorite tools are itty bitty Post-it notes because they're small, which forces you to be concise with your ideas. They lend themselves to be easily rearranged so you can explore different narrative flows. So I'm a big fan of storyboarding, which I just think of as creating a visual outline of your content before you start creating any graphs or slides. Maybe you've done some graphs in your exploration of the data, but the graphs that you make to communicate will likely look different. So I'll start by storyboarding and start by brainstorming, where if I have a project I want to communicate, I'm going to start just by getting the ideas out of my head, out into the world where I can consider them and organize them and do things with them. So I'll spend 5 or 10 minutes just brainstorming. And I do this anytime I'm going to be presenting something new. So oftentimes when I'm presenting, it's not an analysis I've undertaken, but rather strategies for presenting effectively or for communicating with data effectively. Even though I've talked about these topics hundreds, if not thousands, actually probably thousands of times, if I'm coming at it from a new angle or I'm using a different example or different framing, then I start by doing this process. So brainstorm, get all the ideas out, then you edit, which for me is rearranging, grouping things together that are related. I might add some categories or add examples into different places. And this is not the actual example, just a note that says, remember, include this here, or this could be relevant. And then I think about what's the path or what's the journey that I want to lead people on? Do I want to start with a bang and then soften and go through an explanation of something? Or do I want to build up to a crescendo? And I plot things out that will help me achieve that. So oftentimes...
Quick question. How do you decide what you choose for? So building up to a crescendo, starting with a bang. When do you choose each scenario?
Great question. And I think there it comes back to audience and the context. So if I'm in a business setting, I'm a fan of starting with what you're going to be asking of your audience or what you want them to know or do, the thing that they need to not miss. And so that'd be the kind of like start with the bang. So start with the ending, if you will, and then you can work backwards or build your way back to it. It's almost like foreshadowing if you think of dramatic structures in movies or books or plays. That can be a great strategy if you are facing a busy audience and you're not going to have a ton of time. So you get at them right up front with the main message, and then they can ask questions, and you don't run the risk of running out of time before you get to the main point. It's also a great strategy if you already have some built trust with your audience so that you have the credibility to be able to say upfront, here's what we think should happen, or here's what we're wanting to get out of our time together today. I think where you would want to not use that approach can be if you don't have that credibility with your audience and you need to build to that, sometimes going through more of the structure of how you broke apart the problem or the technical details of how you got to your conclusions, depending on the audience, can help build that credibility. Also, if it's a really highly emotionally charged scenario, or if you anticipate you're going to be met with resistance, starting off with the ending or starting off with your point of view can actually backfire big time. So that's where you might want to build up to it, create some shared understanding or some common ground where you do agree with your audience on things before you try to bring them around to your perspective on something where they might not already be there.
Do you ever use characters, like people or personas in your data stories?
I don't use characters in that way. I use stories sometimes where I might tell a story about a client we've worked with and use that as a way to describe a scenario in detail and get people on board where then they're imagining themselves as part of that story. Or I will do, I'll mock present. I think that's a strategy when I'm doing conferences in particular, of wanting people to be able to sort of either see themselves or see a scenario that is familiar, where I'll start off by giving a a typical not good presentation, both my delivery and the graphs and the slides, overwhelming, dense. For me, I'll throw in lots of filler words and read the slide and not make eye contact with my audience. It can make people a little uncomfortable, I think, because there's this brief moment where they're wondering, oh no, is this for real?
Exactly. And how is it for you? Because I've done this once in a presentation in New York, and I felt pretty nervous because I also know when I'm doing a presentation, I would like to start in a confident way, right? Feel confident, feel energetic. And I also felt, because I was doing this mock presentation, I need to make myself small and do the opposite, right? So it was quite difficult for me to turn it on again afterwards. How does it feel for you?
Oh, that's interesting. I love it. I think it's fun. But I wouldn't have been able to do it earlier on. Like, rewind 10 years, and I wouldn't have wanted to do that. It'd be there, and I would have been in the same boat as you. Of like, no, I didn't want to project confidence straight away. But it can actually be a really tricky way to get over any technology issues. So I was presenting at a conference one time, and the slides disconnected as I was doing the bad presentation, and nobody ever knew whether, they assumed it was part of the bad presentation when really it was like, no, the tech failed, and nobody knew. It also, if I have any nerves, I can get through the nerves in that bad presentation, and they're helpful there. But you're right. Then you do need to have this marked switch from that to, hi, my name's Cole, and here's why I'm here, and here's how I'm going to inspire you today.
Right. And what makes it easier, I think what I've experienced is because, of course, the audience is laughing. There's some juice or some energy in the room that wasn't there before, because there's something unexpected. And that's something I always encourage people to also have something unexpected in your presentation, because otherwise the presentation is such a flat line, right?
It can be. Yeah. So I think that's a great tip, something unexpected. And, I talk about this scenario, and people might be thinking, well, yeah, but I'm not presenting to conferences. I'm not going to give a mock presentation. But you can use this same underlying structure for almost any topic. If you think of it as describing the reality of today, whatever that is, versus your ideal, what it could be. And you create tension basically by putting those two things next to each other, and the fact that there's a gap between them. And so anytime you need somebody to understand something in a new way, or do something differently, or think about something differently, that is an approach that you can come back to of, what would things look like in the ideal world? What's the stark reality of today? How do I contrast those things to make that clear? And now that gap is the distance across which you want to move your audience. And they can become the hero of the story when you do that well.
Exactly. Do you have any, when you talk about this contrast, right? The reality today versus future, are there any visualizations that work very well, or are there any things we need to keep in mind when visualizing the before and after?
It's a great question. I don't think there's a certain type of graph that would always be your go-to in a scenario like that, because the context will be different, the data will be different, but there is probably a picture you can paint with a certain type of graph that will fit that scenario. So I'm just thinking through it, and it's funny that you use the words before and after, because we're finishing up our 5th book currently, and it's called Storytelling with Data Before and After. I can think of one of the chapters that I wrote this together with my colleagues, Mike Cisneros and Alex Velez. But one of the chapters I wrote it takes an example where it's an HR generalist who's put together information on, I think it's a sales managers at an organization. And they pulled some information from a dashboard. And so it's a slide packed with graphs. This is one of those I've actually used for the bad presentation that I talked about before. And I'll say it's inspired by true events, but everything's been anonymized. And so the before is just a data dump. It's, a slide full of data followed by a slide full of words and no discussion, no action, no clear. This is a case like you talked about before where maybe I'm really interested in the data, but I've done nothing to connect it to anything tangible for my audience. But it doesn't have to be that way, because when you start to take the different components into account together, in this case, it was, where did they start the year headcount wise? What were additions to the pool through hires and transfers in and promotions to manager? What were the deductions through transfers out and exits? And then where did they end the year? And there's actually some really interesting stories going on within that data. So in that case, the view that helped build that meta picture was a waterfall chart, where you start with today's headcount, show the additions, or the beginning of your headcount, show the additions over the course of the year, the deductions over the course of the year, and the end of your headcount, and then using that as a point to come back to each time after diving more deeply into the specific metric and talking about what it means, how we interpret it. In this case, it was more managers were leaving than were coming in, even though the sales organization was growing and they'd hired historically only internally and needed to revisit how they were doing things. And so this beautiful story that is super actionable and can drive really meaningful conversations about, here's historically we've managed things like this. How should we manage things going forward? Now the data becomes a backbone for that conversation versus numbers where the bigger meaningful picture gets lost. And that's really the transformation that we try to help businesses make.
Yes. I like that you use the word conversation as well, because to me, more presentations need to be more like conversations rather than broadcasts or data dumps. What do you often see? Would you agree?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes you can't. So if you're the one analyzing the data, I think rarely are you in a position to go into a room and say, I've analyzed the data and it says we should do this. That's not how data works. At the end of the day, it's a person who still is going to make the decision, taking data as an input. But when we frame things and when we know our data really well, but we have enough of the context that we can make it meaningful for others, then really amazing discussions and conversations can happen. And I do think, I said we probably don't go in saying the data says we should do this, but I am a big fan of going in with something specific for people to react to. It could be options to consider. It might be a suggested path forward, because if you just go in with data, it's very easy for people to then move on to the next thing, and the discussion never happens. Whereas if you make a suggestion or you outline some options, it gets people talking about the right sort of things. And even if they disagree with your suggested path, they're having the right sort of conversation. And so I'm a big fan of never just ending with your findings. I always take it a step further and make it clear to your audience what they can do, what they should do now, or what they could do now, and be explicit about that. Because as I said, even if you're wrong, you'll get more information now through that, and it'll help get people focusing on the right sorts of things. I think if you go into a scenario and you're coming out with just more requests for data, that means you failed to do that in that scenario. Oftentimes, sometimes there really is more data that needs to be collected. But oftentimes when you've done something that feels thorough and robust and you're feeling good about it and you go to the meeting and come out with more data to collect, that's a sign that something didn't go right.
Yeah. And I've been many times in a position where I presented data and I thought, hey, these insights are pretty logical, but we left the room and nothing happened. And only after I realized, hey, there's something I could have done there. And that was mainly focusing on, like, what's my recommendation or what next steps could we take? Here are some options.
Yep.
You mentioned writing a new book or publishing a new book. And also you have been writing a children's book.
We've been busy on the book front.
To hear a bit more about that. So Why a children's book? Let's start there.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I've spent the past 15 years, more than that now, teaching adults how to visualize data and communicate effectively. And one sentiment that, none of it's rocket science, a lot of it's simple things that when you employ thoughtfully, right, we've talked about a number of those when it comes to how you present, but in the visual presentation, simple things like using color intentionally and getting rid of clutter that doesn't need to be there, putting words that give people the takeaway, right? These simple things can be game changing when it comes to how you communicate with data. And a common sentiment that gets shared with us when we're presenting about this or teaching workshops about this is, I wish I'd learned this sooner. And so I think that, coupled with having my own kids and just watching with fascination as they learned to speak and write and read, and it just seems like if they can learn language at such verbal language at such a young age, that we could be teaching the visual language of numbers and graphs a lot sooner than we typically do. I also love that visualizing data, right, turning numbers into pictures I love it for its creativity and the fact that there's no single quote unquote right way to graph data. Typically, any data can be graphed a lot of different ways. And I love that as an avenue into math because it's not the traditional right or wrong answer that you have in a lot of places in math that I think can be intimidating for people and ultimately turns a lot of people off of math at a pretty young age. So those ideas combined, I knew I wanted to do a data book for kids for a long time. It just took me a while to figure out what it was going to look like. But Daphne Draws Data, a storytelling with data adventure, came out late last year, late 2024. And the heroine is a bright pink dragon named Daphne, and she has a special talent for drawing data, right? Making graphs, basically, but she doesn't call them that. And after getting made fun of by her brother for that not being dragony enough, she leaves her cave in search of a place where she fits in and can be herself. And she goes on an adventure. She goes to the jungle and in the ocean and to outer space. And in each locale, she meets some new creatures, befriends them, and helps them solve a problem by collecting and drawing data. So in the story, it's very pictorial forms of graphs. She's basically drawing them with her crayon. And one of the most fun things that is part of my job now is going and reading to, second graders and third graders. And when I do, I have the illustrations up on the big screen and I show Daphne's data drawings before she's taken her crayon and circled, the answer to the question that she's trying to solve. And also I'll build the graphs for them. And it's amazing how intuitive a well-drawn graph is, where you don't have to say, this bar is bigger than that bar. You can just pose the question and the kids shout out the answer and they're so excited that they're able to see it in the data. And so we'll often do the reading.
Sounds like those presentations are truly conversations as well, like with the kids shouting and being interactive. And
it's super fun. And then we do graphing together as well. But so the story itself is light in terms of there's no technical speak when it comes to graphs. But then after the story, and I won't give away the ending, but after the story, there is a graph glossary that goes through the 4 types of graphs that Daphne draws in her adventures: bar charts, line graphs, pie charts, and scatter plots. And then we've developed a ton of resources at daphnedrawsdata.com to go along with that. Support for parents, resources for educators, activities for kids. Daphne also has a YouTube channel that has a lot of short videos, both aimed at kids and then outlining activities and exercises that parents or educators can do. I'll also mention that we've just rolled out a fun new program. I talked about how I get to go to elementary schools and read to children and do graphing with them. Our new program is called Daphne's Data Detectives, where we're inviting anybody out there who has a love of numbers and graphs and might want to share that with some kids in their life or in their community, to do the same. And we'll give you everything that you need to make that happen, including donating books in a lot of situations. So there's more details of that and everything I talked about at daphnedrawsdata.com.
Amazing. I'll put that link in the show notes as well. I think it's very meaningful to do something for kids as well. Of course, helping adults in their career and maybe life is pretty cool. But to me, there's something special about helping kids understand data or help them learn, because they're so curious, right? More than anyone. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing. Yeah, kids, they ask the best questions. And I think if we could teach them how to hone those questions and how to understand which questions they can actually answer for themselves by collecting data, they're just insatiable when it comes to learning about themselves and about the world around them. And that's really what we're trying to do with the activities that go along with Daphne. And there's some prompts in the book itself, in the glossary, but to have the data that kids collect be something that they care about and something that they can learn through. So, my own kids I use as my guinea pigs, but they track things like, how much time did they spend on a screen in a day, and what was their mood, or what time did they go to bed at night, and how did that impact when they woke up the next morning. So when they can start to see patterns in their behavior and understand, like, oh, that was undesirable, I think I want to do it differently next time. Like, that is amazing, and is this sort of logical problem solving that is going to serve them so well throughout their lives. So yeah, it's fun.
Super fun. That. Yeah. And so we talk about kids. So kids are the future, right? And something I also want to discuss with you is the future of visualization, because right now we can make graphs in seconds, right? With generative AI, they're not always great, but we'll get there at some point. At least that's what I think. But I'm very curious about your perspective. Like, what's the role of Gen AI in all this? And how do you see the future of data storytelling and visualization?
I think one of the fascinating things that we're in the middle of now is, excuse me, how AI is going to be able to help us with speed up the analysis of data and really give us access in ways that we haven't had historically to different types of data. I think back to when I first started working at Google. We would do this massive employee survey every year. And one of my first projects was to read all of the comments from one of these surveys. So it's like hundreds of thousands of comments. I probably didn't read that many, and categorize them, right? Come up with what the categories were and then categorize them. It was this horribly manual process. In retrospect, it was kind of cool because I got to know the company really well through the comments of the employees, but it was painfully time consuming. And that sort of free text analysis now with natural language processing can happen instantaneously at the speed of light. And that I find fascinating. So I think the speed at which we will be able to get at information from data that we just haven't historically had in that way is really exciting. I think we do need to be good, what's the way to say it, like interrogators of what comes out of AI. The ability to ask smart questions and try to poke holes in what has been done versus let anything be black box. I think that can go wrong really quickly. And so we have to, as these tools get better, we have to make sure that we're still assessing and making sure things are done in a robust manner that we understand and can explain. One of the things I'm curious is whether, because the question that usually gets posed to me when it comes to AI is, isn't AI going to make, is AI going to make your job go away? Like, will AI just do the communicating in the future? And I might be naive, but I don't think so, or I think at least not in my lifetime. I don't know, maybe that's naive, but I think it it will absolutely help us make better graphs faster, because those are things structurally that we can put together guidelines and frameworks. And there'll still be some things that go wrong, but we can reduce that, I think, to a large extent through rules and guidelines. But I think when it comes to presenting and the sorts of things that we talked about, of reading the micro expressions of the person in the room, or understanding what happens to the group dialogue when you're sitting over here versus standing over there, like, these aren't things that AI is going to do for us. I don't think. I don't know. Then my brain starts to go to crazy places where these things could go, and maybe eventually it does. But I think if I were doubling down on skills right now as an analyst, one, it would be making sure I'm a super good asker of questions and asker of smart questions, so that I can interrogate the AI and know what it's doing and get a good enough understanding that I can feel confident in it, assuming I'm relying on it for things. And I would also double down on my ability to communicate effectively and understand an audience and understand how to pair what I want to say and what I think should happen with what other people care about and what's going to inspire them to act. Because those are places where human brains and bodies, I think, still win out and will for a while.
Yeah, I'm thinking the same, because the ability to analyze data and to quickly do more manual tasks is something that AI can do super well, much better than we can.
Yeah, anything that can be automated, or when we can put structure around it.
Exactly. But these more nuanced, subtle things, like reading micro expressions and building trust and understanding the nuance of politics, that's still something that is really challenging for AI. And also an opportunity for us to level up and improve our skills, because that's really what will matter a lot. Let's do some quick questions in a rapid fire round.
Okay.
And after, we're gonna wrap up.
Okay.
So, first question: what do you think is the biggest mistake in data visualization?
Well, we already talked about not considering your audience, or the benefits of considering your audience. So I'll pick something else here. I'll say misusing color. And specifically, or usually, that takes the form of overusing color. So I think using color strategically to direct your audience to where you want them to look is the most underutilized strategy that could be put into great effect in explanatory communications.
You mentioned that people put a lot of information on slides. Why do you think that is?
I think it's in a desire to not forget anything and to help prove the robustness maybe of the work that's been done. But for the presenter or for the person communicating, if you're there alongside your graph or your slide, you can say most of those things or wait until you get a question to see if you even need to say them. We don't need to put all of our data or all of our words on the slide. So when you have the benefit of communicating together with a presentation, think of that presentation like your useful assistant. They are not the ones carrying the conversation or the presentation, you are. And so when you need something visual to be able to refer to, that's a great place for that. But you don't want your slide to compete for attention with you. When you're sending something around, you can get away with higher density, but you still want to be aware what needs to be there versus not.
Yeah, that's a good distinction, because many people, they have the same deck, no matter if they're presenting or sending. And I get why it's faster, but it really harms the presentation. Do you consider yourself an introvert, extrovert, ambivert, or none of those?
Introvert for sure is my natural inclination, but I've learned to play extrovert, I think, in ways that have become really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, related to that, one thing just real quick that was a game changer for me was going from sitting when I'm talking to a room of people to standing. There was something about standing up that it was almost like I took on a persona of no longer was I analyst Cole sitting at the table. Now I'm presenting Cole. And I was able, there's just this, I don't know, mind shift that happened. So I would say give yourself a reason to stand up when you're presenting and see what that feels like.
I love that. Very practical. And I feel the same for myself. If I'm standing, it's easier to bring more energy, more confidence.
Yeah.
What's one tip to stay calm before or during presentations?
Breathe. Breathe deeply and get comfortable with pauses. Pausing is one of those things that when you are in front of a group, especially a large group, sometimes even small groups, that can feel really uncomfortable. But when you don't pause and your mouth's just running a mile a minute, your words will get away from you. And then that propels nerves even more. So I would say pause, take deep breaths. You can even use the pauses to punctuate your spoken language. The more that you can appear to be at ease, even if you're not on the inside, one, if you can project that you are, you'll eventually start to feel it as well. But those sorts of emotions are contagious. So nervous energy is contagious, but calm confidence is also contagious. So if you can project that until you feel it, it'll help the rest of the room be on that same page as well.
Amazing. Last question. What's one communication habit that you are still working on?
There's
or
still
skill
some
or
filler
area,
words that I would like to eliminate. I find, especially in podcasts, and I didn't remind myself ahead of this one, so I probably did it a ton. I'm glad we're talking about this at the end, not the beginning, because then I'd be hyper aware and it would be hard to talk. But I still have crutches. I've eliminated a lot of filler words over the years, but especially in podcast land, I, for some reason, enjoy starting sentences with "so" when really just starting with the next word I want to say or coming up with some sort of more thoughtful transition would be better suited. And ending sentences with "right," which I think is a way to help it feel conversational, but it doesn't need that because I can just stop talking and then you'll say something and it will be a conversation. So I'm still working on curbing those. There are other things as well, but that was the first thing that came to mind.
Cool. Then really last question, because you triggered me a lot with new questions. How have you managed to remove the filler words? Because I'm not sure if I've heard any during our conversation.
Oh, they've for sure been there. They have definitely been there. Some of it is just swapping out over time. So there aren't the obvious Recording yourself is the most powerful and potent, I think, way to become aware of the things that you're either saying or doing that you want to curb, but then also understanding when you're using them. And with filler words, oftentimes they come into play when you're trying to think of the next word you want to say. And instead of filling that with sound, just pause. I think if you can get comfortable with pausing, also for me, slowing down. I used to talk a mile a minute and then your brain gets away from your mouth and then filler words eke in because you're no longer in sync. And just slowing down, letting there be some difference in cadence. I've noticed or had the thought that if I were to listen to myself now versus 10 years ago, I sound very different. And it's this measured way of speaking that's come to be just how I speak over time. But it's pausing so that I am not putting in words that don't need to be there. They still eke in sometimes, but it's gotten better.
And that's a benefit then. If you have some materials from yourself long time ago or today, you can compare yourself today with 10 years ago, or in 10 years, compare yourself with today and then be amazed at the difference.
Yeah. And I will say, because we've touched on a lot of things today around planning a presentation, presenting the delivery, that for those who want more strategies and tips there, Storytelling with You, it's the yellow book that we've done, really focuses on that, of the piece of the puzzle that you bring when it comes to communicating with data or communicating anything. So I'd recommend that as a resource to check out.
Cool. Thank you. I'll share that with all the listeners too. Amazing. The last thing I want to ask you, because we've talked about a lot of different things, preparing a presentation, how to calm your nerves, how to bring storytelling, less filler word, more pauses. What's the last tip that you want to share about data visualization, data storytelling, presentations with our audience, that to sum it all up or to end this whole conversation?
You mentioned when we were chatting earlier that a large part of your audience are people who just want to continue learning. And so I think I would leave folks with the tip to just use every time you communicate, every time you make a graph or a slide and have a meeting or talk through something, use it as an opportunity to learn and just reflect on what works well, what should you do more of, and where were there opportunities to refine. And it doesn't have to be overhauling anything. These small, intentional things that we can pick up on and work on over time, right? Might be removing a filler word here or getting rid of some graph clutter there, that over time, those small things can really add up to major impact. And I think have fun and some humility while you're doing it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Cole. I appreciate all the practical tips that you've shared, but also about your journey, because I know it inspires me to hear you speak, knowing and hearing that hasn't always been the case like that. And I hope this inspires everyone to practice their communication every day. And even in the small moments, they can practice, reflect, and improve. So thank you very much. It was so much fun today. And speak soon.